Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 13th week, and this is going to be our last lecture. And before we begin the lecture, let's begin with the land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather today, virtually or physically, wherever you are, mostly it's the land which is traditional unceded territory of Coast Salish peoples. The SFU Burnaby campus is located on the unceded traditional territories of Coquitlam, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As Canadians, we must acknowledge that our country was built on the legacy of colonization, racism, and displacement of Indigenous peoples. I would also like as an additional reminder that in this country and generally around the globe, Indigenous peoples, they have huge contributions towards preserving our environment. And we not only need to credit them with all the hard work that they are doing, but also additionally, we need to contribute and participate as much as we can in trying to help them with their efforts and also ourselves contribute to these preservation-related efforts. Also, I would like to acknowledge that I'm a woman of South Asian and Punjabi heritage, and my own knowledge and my own experience or background might be an impediment to some of the deeper understanding of some of the issues that we discuss in this course, because I do not have that much experience of Canadian context as many of you do. So with that, let's start today's lecture. So today we are going to cover the topic, which is environmental activism and sustainable communities. This is a combination of how well we can participate as activists, why that is important, how we can serve our communities better, and what are the different parameters that need to be included in order to make sure that our communities and all the marginalized communities that we work with or we try to serve, how we can serve all those communities in a better way. So without further ado, let's start with the theoretical and some of the empirical framework that exists. And psychologists, at least since the 1980s, 1990s, they have taken up on this work and they have contributed quite a bit to this research work. So most importantly, we know that there are multiple predictors for our identities, the way we relate with our natural environment or with any other social identities. But when it comes to environmental activism, there has been relatively less research, or also we can say that this work is relatively in its infancy. So the role of nature and how our connection with nature can help us in promoting environmental or activist behaviors. So there are two dimensions, and throughout this discussion, I think it's important that you remember whenever we talk about climate change and our activism, for stopping climate change or for sustainability, we are always working with the assumption that climate change is something that was started or that is an outcome of how we have started to spend our life in a very intensive and in an extensive way on this planet. So because of that, the kind of changes that are coming, we refer to them as anthropogenic roots of climate change. So the core factor or the cause, it's not just epochs of climate-related changes that happen from time to time. Of course, there are certain changes that would happen on their own, but most of the deadly, devastating impacts that we are having on the planet, they are happening because we are not treating our planet well, and that's all the anthropogenic roots of the climate change. So individual consumption and our behaviors, doesn't matter whichever behavior we are talking about, could be like, climate friendly behaviors or climate unfriendly behaviors. So depending upon the kind of identities we hold or the kind of associations with our environment or the connection with nature we have, all of that predicts if we are going to be actively participating in environmental activism or climate-friendly behavior or not. So in addition to that, so there is this one component where we talk about what kind of consumption or activism-related behaviors we engage in. Then there is another dimension, and we will talk about both of these dimensions in this lecture. The second one is the systemic social change, which means that as individuals, of course, we can do our best by participating in more informed consumptions or participating as activists. But when it comes to large scale community-wise or nationwide or globally, the kind of changes that are required for stopping climate change from happening at such a scale, it is important that we talk about those systemic or social change related issues. For example, how our industries need to be regulated, how our economic, social scientists, they need to put forward these changes or these developments that talk much more about the carbon neutral or the slow transition towards zero carbon emissions. Of course, it is going to take time, but as individuals or as members of different communities, what are the ways in which we can contribute? So one of the key elements that research has indicated is related to the identification dynamics or the social identities that we hold close to ourselves. Sorry, why it's going backward. Okay, it's working fine. So in that respect, it's important to note that as you remember in our last lecture, when we talked about our connection with nature and how it can make us feel better, it can reduce our anxiety, it can improve our well-being. But even beyond that, when we are working closely with the nature or with the natural environment, it also helps us to understand the nature better, but also to propagate for the sustainability of the nature and the climate-related actions that are required on individual or mass scales. And we know that there has been plenty of research in the past, especially the work from Nisbet and their colleagues, that has found that the relatedness is with the nature. It's a good predictor for kind of self-declared environmentalism or support for environmental activism, or just being an activist themselves. So if people are not closely netted or closely associated with nature, it's really hard that they are going to be thinking about nature and essentially participating in any kind of activism that would promote sustainability or sustainability related efforts. So initially, we didn't have many scales or many measurement strategies for how to measure our connection with nature and also how to measure our collective identities that would promote more environmental activism. So in this regard, initial work from Meyer and colleagues and also later work from Tam and colleagues, it was really important for scale development and scale validations. And why it is important, because generally we continue to discuss the research that produces a lot of impact for climate change or environmental activism, but we also need to acknowledge people who have contributed massively in development of all of those scales and structures that exist for us as climate psychologists as of today. So this theoretical work is mainly coming from the work of Riker and colleagues and Tajfel and Turner. And as you can imagine, it's mostly embedded in social identification theory. And that theory being at the core of social psychology, I think it offers a lot of room for experimentation, room for understanding scientifically that why and how we can engage our social identities in a way that they can support our climate or our natural world in a better way. So for example, when we look at social identity theory, as you all know, it's more about how we tend to belong to different groups, and we distinctly and positively identify with certain identities. And of course, those identities are embedded in the larger social structures around us. And within those social structures, we, the individuals, they pick on certain identities or certain groups or certain distinctive positive identities that we think are positive, and we formulate those social identities for ourselves. We declare those identities. And then in a sense, when we think of intergroup relations, we always think that we make these comparisons saying that, okay, this is the group where I belong, and then we consciously do an effort to help our group or to discriminate other groups. But what if we think about the superordinate goals, for example, climate crisis as being one of the biggest ones? So how can our declared climate scientist or as climate activist identity, how would that identity translate into something that can actually do better for the whole globe or for general environment of this globe, rather than just thinking about our own micro groups or our own communities? Of course, we need to sustain our communities and think positively about them, but rather than using the whole other domain of discrimination, probably we can use that energy for climate activism and hence for the betterment of the planet. So social identity theory, hence it has been part and parcel and a very important core of most of the work that is happening along identification, especially as climate activists. So in this work, we have seen that pro-environmental behavior, PEB, whenever I will be referring to this construct, this is always going to be pro-environmental behavior. So this social identification theoretical framework that has been used by various researchers to identify how our identification, if we feel connected to the nature, how does that translate into pro-environmental behavior? And when we talk about pro-environmental behavior, there are multiple domains, but more recently, and the work that has been more fruitful for social psychology of climate change, that has been related to either how we consume. So as you know, we were working on this project where we are trying to monitor our behavior over time and how we change that behavior. In a similar way, when we think about changing our behavior, it can be more in the terms of for example, consumption behaviors, or it can be in terms of literally going out, claiming public spaces and doing explicit activism for climate change. So in both cases, we see that like the outcome, of course, is the pro-environmental behavior, but what are the dimensions that we explore through that? So if those dimensions are the outcome, then what are the antecedents or the indicators that we need to measure when we think about our social identities? So in that sense, when we think about connection with nature, certain research, as you can see over here, we see that certain variables, they have been much more of stronger predictors of our pro-environmental behavior compared to many other indicators. So for example, if we have declared environmental identity, and most of the time when I say declared, it means that self-reported. So how do we feel that are we environmentally prone, and to what extent our identity encompasses this environmental identity into our general social identity? Then nature connectedness, this is another scale that has been often used in this kind of research when we think about connection to nature as a form of collective identity. Another one is nature relatedness. And again, as you can see, nature relatedness is pretty closely related with the nature connectedness scale. Another one is inclusion of nature in the self. So basically, if we think of ourselves or our self-identity, then in that identity, of course, we are human beings, we have multiple identities, we identify with multiple communities and multiple causes. So in that self, where is the space for our social identity of ourselves as climate activists or someone who includes nature into their own identity? And also then emotional affinity for nature. So these are multiple skills that have been used, not so extensively because still climate research, environmental research, it's relatively new domain. But but most of these scales, they have very strong intercorrelations, meaning that they have these associations or correlations that indicate that whenever we use some of these scales, we can actually pick any one of them, and we will be able to harness the potential of these scales in order to measure what kind of identity it primes in us and what kind of outcome behaviors are expected out of that. So using this model, we have seen that identity cannot be just something which is very plain. I identify myself as someone who is, let's say, South Asian, or someone who's Canadian, and also someone who is Punjabi, and many other identities. And same would be the case with you. But are these identities politicized? Maybe not. So politicized identities are thought to be things that are actually much more operating on a passionate level, where we have the tendency to go out and claim the spaces and talk about those things more explicitly, compared to where we have very regular known or very implicit identities that are there, but when we go out, we do not explicitly talk or take a lot of pride in those identities, right? So for example, people might have identities being citizens of certain nations, but they might not be very politicized citizens of those nations. In a similar way, when we think about our identities as pro-environmental people, our identities can be simply as environmentally prone or concerned citizens, or it could also be a politicized identity as environmental activists, where it means that you're not just claiming to be someone who identifies with the environment, but you take a step further. You go out and you really participate in all the social movements, or some of the social movements that are connected to that kind of social issue. So in that sense, defining the self at the level of collective identity leads individual to take on the collective interests, values, norms, and work to protect that category, right? So we take action based on the identity, which is politicized. We might have identities, but not all of them, they are politicized. So without a sense of social injustice or supportive norms, people tend to be reluctant to challenge the existing social system. So in that sense, our politicized identities become vital. So having any identity is great, but having that identity politicized, again, that can go either way. If, let's say, we are identifying with something that is negative, of course it will have negative consequences. But if it is something which is a positive identity, of course it can translate into many amazing things, where we can contribute to our environment, contribute to the welfare of our communities, and hence also the planet as well. So moving on, another component that has come up in the recent research is related to a moral obligation. And I'll continue to refer back to this component. So it's a very important one, where remember when we were talking about our motivations can be influenced by fear. Our motivation can be influenced by many other social issues. But when it comes to moral obligations, our moral compass is something that really strongly regulates how we are influenced and how we influence our social environment. So in that sense, that collective sense of identity that we have either with the environment or with the globe, it leads us to become more sensitized towards the threats that are posed to our nature. In addition to that, when we think that we identify with nature, we take more serious actions to prevent those environmental threats or hazards from unfolding. But most of all, the moral obligation, that is something which is very internalized. It's not something that people can come and tell you that, oh, please feel morally obligated for our environment or for our climate. It has to be really part of you, embedded in your own self-identification. And only then you can contribute to the natural environment, to the climate change related issues in a better way. So if there is one factor that would be really important one for trainings or for sustenance of understanding of what is important for environmental activism, that would be probably moral obligation and of course the politicized identity about that environment. So using these frameworks, Schmidt, our own Michael Schmidt, and his colleagues, they used this hypothesis which combined all four factors, which means, for instance, identification with nature. The scale they used was based on identification with nature, politicized environmental identification, and as you can see, identification with nature is slightly and like in an amazing way different than the politicized environmental identification, and moral obligation, which is a very internalized sense of how obligated we feel towards our environment, and then also perception of human threat to nature. So as I said, in most of this work, it is assumed that because the environmental changes and the climate changes, the global warming, it's mostly based on basically on the anthropogenic changes. It's based on human activities. So therefore, if we link all of these, how it is going to impact our activist intentions, and also not only activist intentions, because this is really like, we want to actively participate in activism on climate change, but also how we consume, how we become a burden on the planet, or how we try to reduce our consumption and live more eco-friendly. So it was really important breakthrough to understand identification with nature as an initial indicator, and then as an outcome we saw how environmental activist behavior is going to be impacted. But within that, there are multiple mediations that we could see. Why it is important? So usually we think that, okay, well, if I identify with nature, it's going to give me multiple benefits. So of course, my well-being is going to be better, my anxiety levels are going to be lower. But what about actually going out and taking action? So that question is not that straightforward. People might have all sets of other variables that might be impeding or facilitating the participation in environmental activist behavior. So among them, the most important one that we have seen through research, they have been seen individually, but not as as a collective in one research. So I think in that sense, Michael Schmidt and their colleagues' work, it's been really breakthrough and amazing work to explore that. So we see the politicized environmental identification as one possible mediator, moral obligation as one possible mediator, and then perception of human threats to nature. And all of these, as I said earlier, they have been kind of proposed or explored individually, but not in one research. So therefore, the set of studies that they have conducted in this research, they are really important. So they conducted 3 studies. Out of these 3 studies, the first study was the one where they saw the simple correlations, but their sample was based on real-time data collection, primary data sets, and in this study, throughout, their purpose was to explore the model that we just discussed. So the first study was set up in such a way that they measured the moral obligation as a collective guilt over humans' harm to environment. So all 3 mediators, they are there. And then, as an input variable, they had the identification or the connection with nature, and as an output variable, they had 2 models that I'll be explaining to you later on. The other component, which was really important one, was that in order to look at the collective guilt, they used this scale, which was not directly linked with the moral obligation, which they did later on in their next studies. But in this one, they really focused on the collective guilt. And as you can imagine, collective guilt can be something which would be which could prime a lot of burden or self-related negativity, because guilt is something which is more internalized. And lastly, after using these measures, they asked the participants to report their pro-environmental behavior. And the pro-environmental behavior was measured on two levels, as I said earlier. One was on the pro-environmental behavior, which is more related to activism, where you explicitly ask people if they would go out and actually participate in some activism regarding climate or environment. And the second one was about the consumer or the consumption-related pro-environmental behavior. So, for example, people are taking action to reduce their meat consumption, or they are recycling more, or they are reducing their plastic use or single-use plastic, etc., etc. So, using this kind of design, this is the study they did. So, don't be scared by too many errors and too many things. So, let's look at the two models at the same time, and then we can go over all the correlations one by one. So as you can see in both of these models, this is model 1, this is model 2, it's study in a single study. So what they did, they measured identification with nature. And again, the three mediators that we discussed earlier, the politicized environmental identification, collective guilt, and then perceptions of human threats to nature. And the outcome variable in the first model was environmental activist behavior, as you can see over here. All these variables stay the same, but the output variable was different over here in the second model, which is reduced consumption behavior. So we can see that, well, even if all the initial variables are the same, if we change our outcome variable, our consequences for the same variables are going to shift. So for example, if we see over here in the first model, we see that identification with nature, it leads to politicized environmental identification, and which in turn has a very strong and significant positive association with environmental activism. In a similar way, we see that, yes, identification with nature, it predicts our politicized environmental identification and also our reduced consumption behavior. But as you can see over here, this association is much stronger than this association. So this essentially shows that, yes, our identification with nature is going to translate into environmental activism and also to reduced consumption. But that association with politicized environmental identification is much more stronger for predicting the environmental activism compared to reduced consumption behavior. Essentially, what it shows is that our identification with nature would definitely lead to environmental activism, but the association of politicized environmental identification is much stronger compared to the identification with nature generally. Also, just to explore it a little bit further, if we see over here, identification with nature, it predicts our collective guilt. So if people are identifying with nature, if they're connected with nature, they will feel this collective responsibility or collective guilt, which directly might not translate into environmental behavior. So as you can see over here, this relationship is not significant. But if we feel the responsibility or moral obligation of collective guilt, that will definitely translate into reduced consumption behavior. So what it means that if we want to reduce people's consumption, then probably making them feel guilty about their behavior might be a good strategy. But if we really want to engage people into climate-related activism, we really want them to go out and protest and protect the environment on a larger scale, then probably collective guilt is not the strongest shot we have. In a similar way, when we think about the perception of human threats to nature, so these anthropogenic changes that are happening, there might be a negative relationship with the environmental activism, which means that probably priming people with the perception of human threats to nature, it's not such a great strategy. And if you might remember from our lecture with Dr. Aziz, we saw that if we motivate people, um, threat might not be the ideal tool in our toolbox. So in a similar way, threat to nature by humans as like, explicit priming with that might not also be translated into consumption. So two things that we learn from this model are that, first of all, our identification with nature, yes, it translates into more reduced consumption. But for activism or actively going out and seeking politicized behavior, probably is a politicized environmental identification that would be more important than collective guilt, or more than even perceptions of human threats. But collective guilt is something that is important for our reduced consumption. But again, you might say that, well, this is one study. So how do we talk about this? Also, when we think about collective guilt, of course, it's a negative emotion, a negative collective emotion. So wouldn't it be negatively impacting some of our findings? So in order to change collective guilt into more of a sense of obligation, Schmidt and colleagues, they did another study which modified or instead of using the measure of collective guilt, they actually asked people about moral obligation that they feel, because moral obligation is a positive but still a collective emotion or a collective engagement. So let's see what happened there. So in this study, as I said earlier, instead of using collective guilt, they used the scale for moral obligation. And again, they tested the same model, but the variable in that model, it was switched from collective guilt to collective moral obligation. So in this study, what they found, again, don't be scared of all these arrows. We'll go over them one by one. So if we see, instead of the guilt, if we put moral obligation in here, you see all the arrows, they become quite strong. So basically, our identification with nature is something that, of course, predict our politicized environmental identification, and also moral obligation is something that that is a more stronger of a predictor for environmental activist behavior. And that relationship is sustained through political environmental identification and also through moral obligation. In a similar way, in this case, even if we prime people with the perception of human threats to nature, it will only make this connection with the environmental activism much stronger. Essentially, to simplify, our identification with nature, of course, it predicts environmental activism, but the strongest of this prediction will happen through politicized environmental identification and through moral obligation, and also through perceptions of human threats to nature. On the other hand, if we look at the other variable, which was the reduced consumption behavior, if we want people to reduce their personal consumption behaviors, then probably using the perception of human threats is still not ideal, as we discussed in our last study. And the same is the case with the politicized environmental identification. What it essentially means is that in order for people to reduce their consumption behavior, they don't have to be climate activists. So just the fact that they identify with the nature and just the fact that they feel a moral obligation towards the environment, it's more than enough for motivating people to reduce their consumption behaviors. So generally, as you can see, this model not only replicate the findings from the previous study or the study one from these researchers, but it takes it one step further, indicating that actually moral obligation would be a better priming or a better indicator for us if we want to motivate people either for environmental activism or for reduced consumption of their behavior. And again, they saw that both of these studies, they were rather cross-sectional, and they could not actually state that there is a causal relationship from identification with the environment or connectedness with the environment to the outcome behavior, either like, the consumption behavior or the activist behavior. So in order to make this claim more on a causal basis, they did a third study where they actually did a longitudinal study. At the beginning of the course, they did a survey, and then at the end of the course, they repeated the same survey to see if when people were taught about a course on psychology and environmental sustainability, so after being through this course, being more aware of the environmental causes, being more politicized about these causes, how their behavior from point 1 to point 2, time 1, or to time 2, how this behavior was modified. So what was the causal linkage between their identification or the connection with nature, and how it actually causally translated into the fitting behavior. So for them, the hypothesis for this causal study was that when considered simultaneously, change in politicized environmental identification will predict change in activists' pro-environmental behavior, but change in identification nature will not. So basically, the claim was such that even if people's identification with nature does not change, if there is a change in their activist behavior or in their identification as an activist, that will translate into causal impacts, right? So let's say if I have a certain identity, let's say as a Canadian, my identity with like Canada or identification with this country might stay a bit constant over time or maybe even increase. But when it comes to my politicized identity, that I take a lot of pride in being Canadian. So how does that translate into my pro-environmental behavior? So that kind of connection was made in this study. So how they did it, basically, in this one, they did not use either moral obligation or they did not use the dimension of guilt. So that obligation or that burden of guilt or obligation that was excluded from the study because they wanted to see very clean results of how from time 1 to time 2, the perceptions or identification towards the pro-environmental behavior as an activist or as a consumer changes. So to that end, they regress the activist pro-environmental behavior from time 2. So as you can imagine, of course, if they were measuring the pro-environmental behavior at time 1 and at time 2, so what they did, they used all the measures that were done at the time 1, but they controlled for that. So, okay, they determined a baseline, and on top of that, when they did the regression analysis, where they regressed the activist pro-environmental behavior at time 2 on identification with nature and politicized identification, they really found that this simultaneous control and regression analysis, identification with nature did not predict their self-reported activism, but change in politicized identification did. So it does not matter if you have a certain identification or connection with nature, that connection with nature can lead to or can promote pro-environmental behavior. But when it comes to activism, or when people would actually claim public spaces, go out and protest and protect the physical or the environmental change, on a physical level, that would only be determined by the activist or the climate activist identification of people. So to just summarize these 3 studies, in the first 2 studies, these researchers, they found out that identification with nature is an important component in order to become either environmentally activist or to be more eco-friendly. But this final study, which was a causal, which was focused on finding a causal connection between these variables, it found out that basically it's not just the connection with nature that automatically translates into activism, but rather it's a person's identification as an activist that actually translates into taking more serious physical behaviors in order to protect the environment and in order to take control over the climate-related changes in the world around us. So beyond these studies, when we think about large-scale global studies, some of the studies, for example, the one by Trivium Packaging, this study was done around the globe in 2020. The global survey showed that it's not just on a individual or personal level that some individuals will identify with nature, they will feel connected with nature, and only then they will participate in pro-environmental behavior, or they will serve as activists in their communities. But more than that, generally people are willing to even pay more if they know that some moral obligation of the businesses was sustained in those activities. So for instance, in this survey, they found out that 9 out of 10 consumers, they expect businesses to do more than just their turnout or their profit, which essentially means that if people have to pay more, people would actually pay more in order to participate in eco-friendly behavior. So it's not people, it's actually industries or these mass scale developments which are beyond the individual's control. So yes, as activists, we need to do our job. As individuals, we need to be more pro-environmentally prone, which we already are. Whenever there is an opportunity, whenever someone tells us, we contribute to that. So for example, in this course, throughout this course, all of you have been working really hard on these behavior change projects. And again, this is a learning, but also implementation of that learning. So individuals are much more willing than large-scale organizations to take on these actions and participate in them with full force. Similarly, in this study, they also found that almost 2 out of 3, which means around more than 66% of the consumers, they are willing to pay more for sustainable products. Similarly, 88% of the consumers who would stop buying a product if they learned about the irresponsible business practice, which essentially means that people feel and they sense that moral obligation. They feel guilty if they are consuming something where they know that the company is either not ethical or they're not paying properly to their employees and all of that. On the same study, they also found out that more than 3/4, which means that more than 75% of the consumers, they expect the businesses to be supporting efforts to stop climate change from happening or unfolding on an exacerbated level. And also the business need to serve as a rescue. And this was also projected by 71% of millennials, because they hope that businesses will take the lead on addressing the key social and environmental issues. So at the end of the day, yes, as individuals, we have moral and social obligation to serve our communities and to be activists and more informed of consumers. But we as individuals can't take the whole toll. We really need support from large-scale industries. Just to follow up with this argument on more of a global level. So this global survey, if we look at the stratification of the sample that was covered, it was of course mostly from the westernized, industrialized nations where people have a lot of capital and also a lot of capacity to invest and to also pay the price for whatever it takes to fix the environment in certain ways, wherever it is possible. But what about the developing world? How can they sustain and how can we help them sustain sustain all the climate-related changes and the impacts that are coming on those countries or on those communities. And I think the beauty of this course generally, and especially some of our last lectures, was really that we were able to see that all of us, we are not equally being impacted by the climate change, but also all of us, we have the relatively unequal obligations too, right? So those of us, for example, people like us who have more capacity to contribute, we also have the larger obligation to participate in activism and to inform our communities in different ways. So to that end, the second paper that I have posted on a link to, please make sure to review this paper for your exam because it's an important one in this from this lecture. So in this paper, we talked about how we cannot just say that individuals are the ones where all the responsibility lies. We need to include multi-level or multi-scalar engagements from the public sector, from our communities, of course, from the individuals. But more importantly, we need to see where the impacts are unequal and which are the communities that can actually participate more and participate better, or their voice will be heard easily and they can contribute in a much better way. So this paper was based on multiple researchers, and we did a report for United Nations Commission on Women and how the impact of climate change for women and other genders were much more disproportionate compared to general westernized audience who are living in the westernized and industrialized countries, but particularly when we think about the global south and more marginalized communities, how the impacts for them are much more exacerbated. So in this study or in this review, we generally thought about that mostly when we think about our psychological studies or psychological impacts, we continue to talk about the lowest level or the the micromost level of our analysis, which is the individuals. We continue to tell people that they need to internalize that moral obligation, that consumer behavior, or the sustainability related impacts that are generated from the individuals. But in many cases around the world, individuals do not have a lot of power or a lot of capacity. So how do we guide globally that, okay, let's say if we talk about our Canadian context or our European or North American context, we can and we should probably motivate our individuals for more eco-friendly behavior and also for more sustained ecological and environmental activism. But in many places in the world, there are multiple other levels that are more impactful or act on large scale, and they can also be very violent and very disruptive for the communities and particularly for individuals, could be related to any kind of forces. So for example, when we think of meso-level indicators that might be prevalent in certain societies or in certain countries or continents. So for example, in meso level, we'll think about not only the individual level, but beyond that, for example, what kind of social and gendered norms exist in those countries or in those particularly smaller communities. So for example, what can be buffers? Are people getting enough social support, or are there any kind of a smaller community level governance or infrastructural support systems that are being sustained? Are we offering them any kind of adaptation or mitigation strategies on community level? So all of that, of course, also translates into positive or negative impacts towards climate change. And in these, particularly when we think about developing parts of Asia or developing parts of Africa, we have to think about these levels, because we can't pressurize those individuals beyond their capacity, because they already have no support mechanism within their own communities or within their own state level stakeholders. So macro level is exactly that, where we think about the state level or the large scale social or the cultural forces. So for example, if people are living in extremist religious places, for them, those social norms, they're not going to talk about what kind of gendered analysis or the social or the sexual impacts people might be having. And the same is the case with the climate change. So if people are too worried about those physical or those security related mechanisms in their countries, they might not be able to cope with the exacerbated impacts of climate change. And then largely, when we think about the global level, we really need to think that all nations are very unequal in multiple ways. And particularly when we think about being citizens of richer nations, we do have a large scale obligation, moral obligation to think, to act, and also try to motivate our governments and our infrastructures to be more feasible. And again, I think when we talk about these issues, we cannot also forget that not even in the most developed countries, our infrastructures and the way we are prepared for the environment, it is extremely unequal. And I think we have just in the recent days seen that in BC only, that though we are one of the big provinces creating revenue with immense amount of infrastructure, but even our own infrastructures are not well adapted, and we are not still doing well enough efforts for climate mitigation. We are still selling out to many of those companies which would be happy to pay us the price for reducing the carbon tax or whatsoever. So in that sense, we do have climate inequalities within our own nations on the global level. But then when we go to even smaller nations, the impacts are much more large scales. So for that, we have a much larger obligation to support the individuals from those communities where they might not have their voice, or their governments or their communities or their structures might not allow for that voice to be heard, or people are not even able to speak for their climate or for their environment. So in that sense, I think it's important as a constant reminder that, of course, yes, climate change is going to impact all of us around the world. And hence, all of us, we really need to go to public spaces, protest and protect our environment. But still, we also need to see that not all of this is equal. In our own research, in multiple other places, in South Asia, in Africa, in Nairobi, in Sao Paulo, in many places around the world, where we have seen that, and also World Health Organization report, it constantly supports these micro or the community level data sets with the supplement that people who are living in poverty, people who are working outdoors, or people who are growing in an environment where there is a lot of pollution. And if we look at the polluted cities in the world, most of them, they are also lying in the developing world. So the kind of vulnerabilities, health-wise, climate-wise, we are giving to the younger generations and children, it's really appalling. And the shift for the climate activism, it has to start from here. It has to start from our developed world. So it's important to constantly understand that climate change is playing out very unequally, but also for that, many of us who are living in the developed world, we have a much larger moral obligation to support eco-friendly behavior and also to protest these climate-related changes as they're unfolding. So when we think about vulnerable communities around the world, and as I said earlier, many states and many communities are much more vulnerable, and particularly the ones who are living in some of the poorest cities in the world. Now we know that more than 60% of the population of the world, it has moved to the cities or the urban centers. And if those urban centers are not able to sustain them, there are multiple levels of harms that these people are going to be exposed to. So of course, the most prominent one, and we all know, is the environmental harm, which means that people are living in informal housing with close proximity to open water sources, the land degradation, pollution, and water insecurity. Similarly, Anwar et al., their work has also shown that in many places of the world where governments are more autocratic or there is more of dictators running those countries, there is a lot of development which is also very violent, in a sense that there are incompetent authorities, incompetent engineering, or corporate land grabs, which are causing displacements of poor communities, leading to a much more negative impact on people who are stated as encroachers. And the large-scale corporate development is harming the small-scale communities which do not have any tools to protect themselves against climate change mitigation or adaptation, and there are no tools available for them. And lastly, of course, the socio-economic impacts are massive. So countries are unequal, but within them, there are cities that are extremely unequal, and the impacts for the poorest of those cities and communities, that is going to be much larger. So on a socioeconomic level, there are social norms of inequality that prevail in these countries. There is economic insecurity and the politics which prevail a lot of violence. There is struggle for resources. There's socio-spatial segregation that continues to persist in many of those communities, which leads to large-scale harming of these vulnerable communities. So in that sense, it's important to kind of stay cognizant of the fact that when we think that, well, okay, these countries are extremely vulnerable, why can't they come and protest? Or they participate, or they can't participate in global forums such as COP26. It might be just the fact that their governments don't want them to be there because they do not want their development to be impeded or hampered by these communities that are being impacted on a large scale. Also, one important thing that I really wanted to bring forward, it's related to how climate change is also very gendered. So the impacts of climate change are not very equal. So because of climate change, there are places in the world where we are running out of water. So for example, if we think about global south generally, or when we think about Lake Chad region, or let's say many other countries in Africa, we see that because of climate related irregularities in our weather patterns, we are seeing that water is becoming a scarce resource, because of which people are losing much of their irrigable land and also general access to water. And because of that, women have to now travel to much longer distances. Even if we think about Third Desert, or we think of many other deserts in the global south, women have to travel to much larger distances, and people who are gender diverse or women, they are becoming much more vulnerable to physical harms or hazards, because they are not protected anymore, and they have to leave the security of their homes or their known environments to a much longer distances now. And we have seen this in multiple research coming from the global south now, that it's also creating much more unrest in these communities. So on a meso level, on a macro level, on all of these levels, these communities are being impacted, but particularly the impacts, the gendered impacts of climate change, that are becoming much more visible now. Similarly, when we think of the states that are patriarchal, where either the leadership is very masculine, or they are psychologically least concerned about the gender diverse or sexuality diverse communities. We are seeing that now with the exacerbated climate changes, people are also becoming much more conservative in these domains. We are also starting a new project where we have been indicated by global practitioners that in the places where we are seeing more or the heightened impacts of climate change, people are becoming more radicalized in different ways. So it could be there is more gang violence, there is more urban violence, there is more extremism prevailing. So, I mean, these are the impacts which are costing people a lot of money. And just if we look at a very small example, which is the violence against women or gender-based violence that's happening around the world, globally, we are losing around 3.7% of our gross domestic product because of these violent incidents. And over time, from a psychological perspective, when direct impacts are not represented or they are not felt, the psychologically efficient response to this is also denied. Or these nations which are very patriarchal or security oriented or security states, they try to distance these issues as well. So they will be more focused on the physical impacts, and then the psychological impacts, of course, they will go back in the background again. Similarly, we have seen that generally in the regions where we are seeing the stronger impacts of climate change, rape related cases or other forms of violence, gender-based violence, it has been kind of exacerbating quite a lot. And mostly, as I said earlier, it's the women or gender diverse communities which are mostly responsible for bringing water from very distant places to their homes. And now because their water resources are shrinking, these communities are rendered much more vulnerable too. So the impacts of climate change globally, of course, they are unequal, but then within these communities, we see that certain subsets of our populations, which are already vulnerable to different kinds of violence, they are now being prone to even higher levels of violence. So another dimension that has been discussed in some of our recent work, it also looks at the intersection of different forms of violence. So it's not just the individuals who are suffering or the certain communities who are suffering, or let's say gender diverse populations who are suffering. So for example, in some of our studies in Karachi and Rawalpindi, we also explored that transgender populations of those cities, they were heavily impacted in the last heat waves that were there, because their economic dependence is pretty much on being on the roads and doing different chores for different other communities. So all of these impacts, they also intersect on multiple levels. So yes, there are collective damages to infrastructure, the collective insecurities and vulnerabilities, but these impacts, they also intersect, which means that when multiple vulnerabilities will come together, people will have multiple levels of harms. So in these intersectional harms, we have seen that there is an increase in domestic and communal violence that spills over to multiple other levels. So for example, there is already gender-based discrimination or violence in certain communities, and then because of heat waves and many other climate-related changes, we are seeing that spill over into other areas too. Similarly, structural violence, it's also exacerbating, which is restricting women and gender diverse populations across the world. Lastly, the mobilization of men into non-state armed groups is becoming quite rampant now. So we have seen this in Lake Chad region. We are also seeing this in multiple other gang formations. So the urban violence is also going to get worse if we are not going to make our cities more adapted, or we are not going to mitigate the impacts of climate change explicitly. Another thing that I just wanted to kind of bring to your attention and to give a perspective on when we talk about the fundraising issues that we are constantly reminded of, that came out of COP26. So as you might remember, that there has been a lot of debate and there has been a lot of noise about, oh, how we are going to raise $100 billion for climate change and the impacts of climate change to adapt or to mitigate certain things. But if we look at the scale of the water security and the fragility related challenges it's posing to the globe, we would be able to see that, the losses that we are bearing every year and we are going to continue to bear, they are just so humongous. So this data, which is coming from 2020 survey from World Bank, it shows that there are roughly 2 billion people who live in countries where development outcomes are affected by fragility. Essentially meaning that, this big population of the world, it's being put through much more fragility because of water insecurity issues. Similarly, we've also seen through this survey that around $260 billion in the global economic losses from the inadequate water supply and sanitation services. So literally, if we are losing this many dollars because of water insecurity, are we still concerned about just raising $100 billion? It's really insane to even think about the scale of losses the poor world is bearing and they are going through, and then compare those scales with the amount of money that rich world doesn't have the willingness to raise, because all of them, they have capacity. Even single country can donate this much money. And we have seen that there has been $1 trillion budget around the world in most of the richer countries to provide social support to their own communities. But that inequality, we just do not wish to see what's happening in the globally developing world. Similarly, 46% of the global poor, they are projected to be living in fragile contexts by 2030. And this is just around the corner. We are not talking about couple of hundreds of years or couple of decades. It's going to happen just through this decade. Also, we know that $120 billion they are expected from annual property damage which will happen due to flooding. And if we just reflect on what happened in Abbotsford or in the southern BC or in Merritt, just in last few weeks, we have seen examples just around us, and it's really disturbing to even imagine why we are not able to think about climate change on a global scale. Now that we are not any distant from these impacts, we are right into it. We are not just standing outside and seeing it from the distance. Also, lastly, 95% of refugees and internally displaced people live in developing countries, originally from the same conflict since 1991. So just imagine when countries like ours and many others, rich countries, when they go out and state that, well, we don't want to take any more refugees, or we are taking too many refugees, or there are too many refugees coming to our borders. And I think the recent most incident, I hope many of you are aware of that, what happened on the borders of the UK, where many refugees, their boats were capsized, and many of them, they died. We tend to forget that only 5% of global refugees, or even less than that, might end up on our borders if ever we allow them. So basically, most of the refugees, they are moving around and being bounced from one place to another, still in the globally developing world. They will never hit our borders, and we will never give them an opportunity. And I'm not saying that people should just move around and become refugees, but we are going to face many more climate refugees in the near future. And we do not have even the heart to raise $100 billion. I don't know what we are going to be able to do for those people. So therefore, I think it's super important that wherever you see the issues related to climate change, environmental activism, participate wholeheartedly and do whatever you can do in your own capacity. So just to conclude, and this is my last slide, So basically, there are certain recommendations that we have learned from our own research, and when we go around and we talk to researchers and practitioners, these are the 4 recommendations that are really important and kind of the ones that we can encourage people to participate in. First of all, we need to encourage and facilitate persons to participate in political environmental activism. So as I said earlier, yes, we need to connect people to nature, but more importantly, in order to get something done, we need to make sure that people participate in climate activism. Secondly, we need to develop more resilient livelihoods for people. And thirdly, we need to invest in public information campaigns, because still in our rich world, there is plenty of population which still does not believe in climate change. So how we are going to get our messages through them? We really need to have public level campaigns on that. And lastly, we need to mobilize our own countries, our own communities, climate infrastructure to fulfill its duties under the Climate Change Acts, which means that if we are ratifying all the conventions of, let's say, COP 26 or any other climate conventions that our country and our communities have signed up for, this is probably the time that we really reflect back and we act on all of those promises that we have made to our people and to our countries and to our citizens. So these are some of the references on which today's presentation was based on. Also, just a reminder, both of these readings are posted on your module for today. I'll also post the slides for today. Just make sure that you review both of these readings out of this week. And then lastly, thank you so much. I really appreciate that you joined me for this course. Thank you so much for listening throughout. I know sometimes this course has kind of given a sense that there is hopelessness, but I think all of you being here, it gives me a lot of hope that this is something that is doable and will be able to deliver on all the promises that we have done to our younger generations. And also, I do hope that you will continue to work for environment, all the projects that you are engaged in, all the things that you are doing. I really hope that you will continue to contribute and actively participate in climate and sustainability related causes, because it's a journey and we all need to work together and to kind of make a push to our governments to do something about it. We can and we must do everything and whatever it takes to protect and preserve and ensure that our planet thrives, not only for ourselves, but for all the generations that still have to come. And with this, I thank you all. And yeah, I'll see you in another lecture. And we'll continue these discussions and debates. So here, I think I'll take a break for 15 minutes and then I'll come back. We can have all the questions that you have. If you think that we don't need a break, we can continue our discussion. Just let me know how you would like to proceed.